Snow fell heavily, blanketing the Montana wilderness in a thick, unbroken sheet of white. The trees groaned under the weight of ice, their skeletal branches shivering against the biting wind that howled through the valley. Inside a small, weathered log cabin, Tom Grady adjusted the wick on his oil lamp, the dim glow flickering against the rough wooden walls. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that turned breath into ice the moment it left your lips. Tom had lived through winters like this before, but something about this one felt different, harsher, more relentless, as if the land itself was testing him. Tom had spent most of his life in the wilderness, first as a park ranger in Yellowstone, and now, in retirement, as an observer of the wild. He had chosen this life deliberately, exchanging the comforts of town for solitude among the mountains and the creatures that roamed them. His days were filled with tracking, watching, and sometimes even speaking aloud to the land and its inhabitants. He had always felt more at home here than anywhere else. He had prepared well for the coming storm, firewood stacked high against the back wall, canned goods lined neatly on a shelf, his rifle cleaned and ready. The radio crackled from time to time, issuing warnings of the blizzard that was sweeping down from Canada. It would be a bad one. He had seen storms before that could bury a man alive if he wasn't careful. But he was ready, or so he thought. Then came the sound, faint at first, nearly lost beneath the wind, but unmistakable, a deep, guttural growl, followed by the heavy, deliberate crunch of snow beneath massive paws. Tom set his coffee mug down slowly, his body going still. He had spent decades learning the language of the wild, and he knew that sound. A bear, and not just any bear, a grizzly. He moved cautiously to the frosted window and peered out. At first, he saw nothing but white and shadow. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he spotted it, half buried in the snow, just beyond the tree line. A massive grizzly, its fur dusted with frost, its breaths coming slow and labored. Something was wrong. The bear should have been hibernating by now, tucked away in some hidden den beneath the earth. But here it was, out in the open, in the heart of a deadly storm. Tom grabbed his coat, pulled his hat low over his ears, and stepped outside, bracing against the wind that clawed at his face. He moved slowly, cautiously, keeping his rifle slung over his shoulder but making no move toward it. As he drew closer, he could see the bear more clearly, a male, old, with scars that told the story of a long, hard life. Its left front paw was swollen, the fur matted with blood. It must have been injured, likely weeks ago, and now the cold was sapping its strength. The bear lifted its head slightly, dark eyes locking onto Tom's. There was no fear in them, no aggression, only exhaustion. It was a look Tom had seen before, in the eyes of wounded animals, in the eyes of men who had fought too long and too hard. He exhaled slowly, a puff of vapor escaping into the air. "You shouldn't be out here," he muttered, more to himself than to the bear. The animal blinked, its great chest rising and falling with effort. Tom knew the bear wouldn't survive long in this state. Out here, in this storm, it was a death sentence. He stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping into his bones, wrestling with an old instinct that told him to let nature take its course. But he couldn't do it. He turned back to the cabin, then hesitated before making a decision that went against every rule he had ever followed. He trudged back inside, grabbed an old blanket, and then returned to the bear. Carefully, he laid the blanket over its back, covering its exposed body from the worst of the wind. The bear didn't react, just kept breathing, watching him with those deep, tired eyes. Tom knelt beside it, inspecting the wounded paw more closely. Infection, not fresh, but not fatal, at least. Not if the bear got help. He thought of all the times he had seen creatures in the wild succumb to wounds just like this. He thought of the years he had spent protecting animals like this one, ensuring their safety, their survival. The night wore on, and Tom stayed by the bear's side, bringing out a small bowl of water, then some leftover venison from his stores. It wasn't much, but it was something. The bear sniffed at it but didn't eat. Not yet. Tom settled into the snow beside it, watching the storm roll in, feeling the deep pull of something ancient and unspoken between him and the beast. In the early hours before dawn, the wind roared through the valley like a living thing, shaking the trees, rattling the cabin's walls. Tom stayed outside, his coat pulled tight around him, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He should have gone inside. He should have left the bear to its fate. But he didn't. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world wrapped in silence and snow. Tom stirred, his joints aching, his fingers stiff from the cold. He looked over at the bear, expecting stillness, expecting death. Instead, he found eyes staring back at him, clearer now, more alert. The bear shifted slightly, testing its injured paw. Tom stood, stretching out the stiffness in his legs. He took a step back, and the bear, slowly, painfully, rose to its feet. It swayed for a moment, then steadied itself. It turned to look at him one last time, holding his gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then, without a sound, it lumbered toward the trees, disappearing into the white wilderness beyond. Tom watched it go, feeling something inside him shift, something deep, something he couldn't quite name. He had spent a lifetime among these creatures, studying them, protecting them, but this felt different. This wasn't just survival, it wasn't just nature at work, it was something more. As he turned back toward his cabin, the wind carried the faint echo of the bear's presence, a memory left behind in the snow. Tom knew he would never see that bear again, but he also knew, in some way, that it would always be there, in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the woods, in the wild heart of the land he called home. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, shaking the cabin's walls and rattling the frosted windows. The storm had arrived in full force, a swirling chaos of snow and ice that swallowed the world outside. Inside, Tom Grady sat near the wood stove, sipping a cup of coffee, his rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach. He had spent the afternoon making sure everything was in order, the generator fueled, food supplies stocked, and the heating system working. He had seen blizzards like this before, and he knew they were nothing to take lightly. In weather like this, a single mistake could be fatal. He adjusted the lamp's flame and listened to the wind scream across the valley. It was a sound he had grown used to over the years, a reminder of nature's raw, untamed power. But then, beneath the howling gusts, he heard something else, something faint but distinct. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but weaker, strained. Tom frowned and rose from his chair, moving toward the window. The glass was already coated with frost, but he wiped it with his sleeve, peering into the white abyss outside. At first, he saw nothing but the shifting shadows of the storm. But then, movement, dark shapes against the snow. He squinted, his breath fogging against the window pane. Bears, a mother grizzly and two cubs, their fur matted with ice, their bodies shivering violently. The mother stood unsteadily, her head hanging low, while the cubs clung to her sides, their tiny forms half buried in the snow. Tom's gut tightened. This wasn't right. By now, all bears should have been deep in hibernation, tucked away in their dens, safe from the lethal cold. If this mother and her cubs were out in the middle of a blizzard, something had gone terribly wrong. His first instinct was to stay put. He had spent decades in the wilderness, and he knew better than to interfere with nature's course. But as he watched the mother bear sway on her feet, struggling to stay upright, he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. If he did nothing, they wouldn't last the night. Swearing under his breath, he grabbed his coat and hat, pulled on his thick gloves, and opened the door. The wind hit him like a hammer, nearly knocking the breath from his lungs. He braced himself, stepping out onto the porch, the snow already knee-deep. The mother bear lifted her head at his approach, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no aggression in her gaze, no warning, just exhaustion. Tom took slow, deliberate steps, keeping his movements steady. He knew she was too weak to attack, but instinct was a powerful thing. "You shouldn't be out here," he muttered, though he knew she didn't understand. He glanced at the cubs, barely moving, their small bodies trembling. He had to make a decision, and fast. Turning back toward the cabin, he grabbed an old tarp from a hook on the porch and spread it on the snow. Then, moving carefully, he knelt down, ignoring the biting cold as he reached toward one of the cubs. The tiny bear barely reacted, its fur stiff with ice. He scooped it up, feeling its frail weight against his chest, and placed it on the tarp. The second cub followed, so small and still that it made his chest tighten. Now for the mother. She let out a weak rumble as he stepped closer. But she didn't move. Up close, he could see how thin she was, her ribs faintly visible beneath her fur. Whatever had happened, whether their den had been destroyed, or something had driven them out, they had been wandering for too long. Tom knew she wouldn't make it inside on her own. He had no choice. He hurried back to the cabin, grabbed the only thing strong enough to help, a thick tow rope. Moving as quickly as he could, he looped it around the mother bear's body, securing it just behind her front legs. Then, he pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. She was too weak to resist, but too heavy for him to move easily. Tom gritted his teeth and pulled harder, digging his boots into the snow. Inch by inch, he dragged her toward the cabin, sweat freezing against his skin. The cubs stirred on the tarp, but they didn't cry out. They were beyond fear now, just cold, just tired. It took him nearly 20 minutes to get the mother bear up onto the porch. By the time he did, his legs were burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm raged around him, but he barely noticed. He turned, hauled the tarp with the cubs into the cabin first, then went back for the mother. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately. The mother collapsed onto the wooden floor, her breathing heavy but steady. The cubs curled up against her, their small bodies still shivering but no longer stiff with cold. Tom moved quickly, grabbing blankets and laying them over the bears. Careful not to spook them. He filled a bowl with warm water and set it near the mother's nose. At first, she didn't react, but after a long moment, she sniffed at it, then lapped up a few cautious sips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He sat down heavily in his chair, rubbing his hands together to get the feeling back into his fingers. What the hell was he doing? He had spent his whole life living by the rules of the wild, respecting the balance of nature. But tonight, that balance had shifted. He had seen creatures suffer before, had watched them die when the odds were too great. But this time, he couldn't just stand by and let it happen. The fire crackled in the stove, filling the cabin with a soft, steady heat. Tom watched as the mother bear slowly closed her eyes, her breathing deepening. The cubs pressed close to her, their tiny bodies finally still. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For now, they were safe. Tomorrow, when the storm passed, he would figure out what to do next. Maybe he would try to track where they had come from, see if there was any chance of finding them a new den. Maybe he would call in an old favor, see if the park service could help. But for tonight, they would rest. Tom leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind rage outside. He had spent so many years alone, choosing solitude over the chaos of the world beyond the mountains. But tonight, in the dim glow of the firelight, with the sound of the bear's quiet breathing filling the cabin, he realized something. He wasn't alone, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind it. The wind roared like a living beast, tearing through the valley, rattling the walls of the cabin. Snow piled higher against the door, and the world beyond the window had vanished into a swirling white void. Tom Grady sat by the fire, his hands clasped tightly together, staring at the three bears curled up on his wooden floor. The mother grizzly lay still, her breath shallow but steady, her cubs huddled against her, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each labored breath. He had broken the most fundamental rule of living in the wilderness: never let wildlife get too close. Never interfere. He had spent his life preaching that very lesson to park visitors in Yellowstone. Nature must take its course. He had told them 1,000 times, when they asked why he couldn't step in to save an injured elk or rescue a struggling wolf pup. But as he looked at the mother bear, her fur still stiff with frost, her cubs no longer shivering but far too weak, he knew he had already crossed that line. Now, another problem loomed. They couldn't stay here. It was a miracle the bears had even made it inside without panic or aggression. But the longer they stayed, the greater the risk. If the mother regained her strength, instinct could take over, and instinct told a bear that an enclosed space with a human was a trap. Tom had seen the aftermath of desperate animals trying to escape confined areas, broken walls, splintered doors, a trail of destruction. He couldn't risk that, but he also couldn't send them back into the storm. Tom stood slowly, stretching out the stiffness in his legs. His cabin wasn't big, just a single room with a cot, a stove, and enough space for one man to live simply. It wasn't meant to house 3 bears. His mind turned to the only other structure nearby, the tool shed. It sat about 40 yards from the main cabin, built solid against the wind, with thick wooden walls and a heavy door. It wasn't insulated like the cabin, but it would block the wind, keep them dry, and, most importantly, keep them out of his living space. If they could make it there, they might stand a chance. But how the hell was he going to get them there? He glanced at the mother bear again. She was too weak to walk on her own, but if she regained just enough energy, she might follow her cubs. The cubs, though, they were small, light, he could carry them. Tom exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face. He was about to do something incredibly stupid. Moving carefully, he grabbed his coat, pulled on his gloves, and reached for the tarp he had used earlier. The cubs didn't stir as he bundled them together, wrapping them as gently as he could. They were warm now, at least warmer than before, and he had no doubt that their mother would fight to follow them if she saw them moving away. The hard part would be leading her without startling her. Tom took a deep breath, then carefully, cautiously, lifted the bundled cubs into his arms. They barely reacted, their small bodies limp with exhaustion. He turned toward the door, hesitating for just a second before unlatching it. The storm had calmed slightly, but the air was still thick with snow, the wind biting against his exposed skin as he stepped outside. The cold hit him like a hammer, but he forced himself forward. 1 step, 2, he felt the weight of the cubs shift slightly in his arms. But they made no noise. Behind him, the mother bear let out a low, rumbling sound. She was watching. That was good. Tom moved carefully, deliberately, trudging through the deep snow toward the shed. It felt like an eternity. His breath ragged, ice forming along the edges of his beard. When he finally reached the door, he kicked it open with his boot and stepped inside. The shed was dark, colder than the cabin but still sheltered. It smelled of old wood and machine oil, the tools lining the walls glinting faintly in the dim light from the open door. He set the cubs down in the far corner, against a pile of old burlap sacks, then backed away. Now came the hard part. He stepped back outside, standing just beyond the doorway. The mother bear was still lying on the floor of the cabin. Her head lifted now, her eyes locked onto him. Tom took a step back, then another. He had to trust that she would follow. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The wind howled through the trees. Then, with a slow, painful motion, the mother bear shifted. She pushed herself up onto her front legs, swaying as she did. A weak, rasping breath escaped her throat as she dragged herself forward, her movements sluggish but determined. Tom stepped back again. She moved toward the doorway, her paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. Another step, another. Her massive form loomed in the doorway now, her head lifting slightly as she sniffed the air. She hesitated, just for a second, then lumbered forward, disappearing into the darkness of the shed. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He waited a few moments, listening. No sounds of distress, no signs of panic, just the deep, exhausted breathing of an animal finally out of the storm. Slowly, he reached for the shed door and pulled it shut, latching it securely. Then he stepped back and stared at the structure, snow swirling around him, his heart still pounding in his chest. They would be safe for now. Tomorrow, when the storm passed, he would figure out the next step. Maybe he could find the remnants of their den, see if it was possible to guide them back to safety. Maybe he would have to call in help. But for tonight, they would rest. And for the first time in years, Tom felt something he hadn't in a long time, a quiet sense of purpose. The wilderness had always been harsh, unforgiving, but it had also always been home. And tonight, as the storm raged outside, he realized something. Home wasn't just a place. It was a responsibility, and he had just chosen to bear it. The wind cut through the valley like a knife, howling against the cabin walls, rattling the frost-covered windows. Tom Grady stood by the door, his breath fogging in the cold air, his fingers curled tightly around a thick woolen blanket. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to step back inside, to let nature take its course. But as he looked out at the mother grizzly and her two shivering cubs, instincts gave way to something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. Moving carefully, he stepped onto the porch, boots crunching against the snow-packed wood. The mother bear lifted her head, dark eyes locking onto him. There was no growl, no warning lunge, just exhaustion. She was too weak to attack. But that didn't mean she wouldn't if she felt threatened. Tom had spent his life reading the body language of animals, and he knew this was a moment of razor-thin balance. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his arm and tossed the heavy blanket onto the snow a few feet from the bears. It landed in a muted thud, the fabric instantly collecting a dusting of frost. Tom didn't move, didn't speak, he just watched. The mother bear sniffed the air, her nose twitching. For a long moment, she simply sat there, eyes flicking between Tom and the unfamiliar object. Then, to his surprise, she leaned forward slightly, inhaling the scent of the blanket. She didn't attack it, didn't flee, just studied it, her breath sending small clouds of steam into the freezing night. Tom exhaled slowly. That was a good sign. But time was running out. The cubs were too weak to last much longer in this cold. And if the mother bear didn't find shelter soon, she wouldn't survive either. Tom had made his choice the moment he let them inside his cabin. And now he was committed. Turning slowly, he walked toward the shed, moving cautiously so as not to startle the bears. His every step felt deliberate, measured. He reached the door, unlatched it, and pushed it open. The inside was dark and cold, but it was shelter, protection from the wind, from the worst of the storm. Then came the moment of risk. Tom didn't try to force the bears to move. Instead, he stepped back, giving them space, allowing the mother to decide for herself. He knew if he tried to rush this, if he made a wrong move, it could all go sideways fast. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant creaks of bending branches, the occasional snap of ice breaking under the weight of snow. The mother bear remained still, her body heavy with exhaustion. Then one of the cubs tried to move. It was small, barely more than a bundle of frozen fur, and as it attempted to take a step forward, its legs gave out. With a soft whimper, it collapsed into the snow. Tom's breath caught in his throat. The mother bear made a low, rumbling noise, a sound of distress, of frustration, of something primal and deep. She looked down at her fallen cub, then up at Tom. Her gaze lingered on him, not with aggression, but with something he could only describe as recognition. He didn't move. Then, slowly, painfully, the mother bear leaned down, gently gripping the cub by the scruff of its neck. With great effort, she pulled it toward the open shed door. Snow clung to her fur, ice crusted around her paws. But she kept moving, step by step. Tom remained still, watching as she dragged her cub across the frozen ground. When she reached the threshold of the shed, she hesitated. The darkness inside must have felt foreign, uncertain. She turned her head slightly, glancing at Tom one last time. Then she pulled her cub inside. The second cub, though weak, stumbled after her, its tiny legs barely carrying it forward. Tom waited until the last trace of her shadow disappeared into the shed before he moved. Carefully, cautiously, he stepped forward and reached for the door. He didn't slam it, didn't make any sudden moves. Instead, he quietly pulled it closed, securing the latch with steady hands. Then he stepped back. For a long moment, he simply stood there, breathing in the freezing air, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. He had just led a mother grizzly and her cubs into shelter. He had just broken one of the most fundamental rules of wilderness survival. And yet, he felt no regret. Through a small gap in the wooden planks, he could see them inside. The mother bear settled into the straw-lined floor, curling her body around her cubs. She shifted slightly, lowering her head, and then, something incredible. She began licking them, her warm breath and tongue working to melt the ice clinging to their fur. Tom swallowed hard. He had seen animals care for their young many times before. But something about this moment, something about witnessing it after all that had happened, hit him in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't just survival. This was love. He stepped back further, giving them their space, knowing that now, at least for tonight, they would be safe. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Maybe when the storm passed, he would open the shed and they would simply leave, disappearing back into the wild where they belonged. Or maybe, just maybe, fate had other plans. Either way, he knew one thing. Tonight, in the heart of the storm, he had chosen to act, to defy the rules he had spent a lifetime following. And as he walked back toward his cabin, the wind at his back, he realized something. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. For 3 days, the storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees, rattling the walls of the cabin and piling snow in thick, heavy drifts against the door. Tom Grady spent those days watching, waiting. Through a small gap in the shed's wooden planks, he observed the mother bear and her cubs, careful not to intrude, careful not to disrupt the fragile balance they had struck. He left water and food near the shed's entrance, a bit of dried meat, some leftover venison, nothing much. He wasn't sure if she would take it, but each time he checked, the food was gone, not while he was watching, never while he was near. She ate only when he left, a reminder that even in this strange truce between man and beast, instinct still ruled. The cubs grew stronger with each passing day. At first, they barely moved, their small bodies curled tightly against their mother's warmth. But soon, Tom saw them stir, saw them rise on wobbly legs, saw them nuzzle against her belly. The mother bear, too, was recovering. She still looked thin, her fur still carried the weight of the cold, but her breathing was steadier, her eyes sharper. She was regaining herself. Tom knew what that meant. The storm had finally broken on the morning of the 4th day. The air was still frigid, but the winds had died down, leaving behind a world of white and silence. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that only came after a blizzard, when the land lay in quiet, untouched stillness. It was time. Tom stood outside the shed, his breath clouding in the air, his hands resting at his sides. He had thought about this moment, had tried to prepare himself for it, but now that it was here, a strange hesitation settled over him. He had spent his life believing in the laws of the wild, in the hard, unwavering truth that nature belonged to itself. He had told countless park visitors in Yellowstone that wild animals should never grow dependent on people. That intervention often did more harm than good. And yet, here he was, standing before a shed that sheltered a mother bear and her cubs, alive because he had intervened. But he had never tried to tame them. He had never tried to change them. He had simply given them a chance to fight. And they had done the rest. Taking a deep breath, he unlatched the shed door and pulled it open. Inside, the mother bear lifted her head instantly, her ears pricking forward. The cubs, now more alert, shifted against her, blinking at the sudden burst of cold light. Snowflakes drifted into the shed, catching in the air like tiny frozen stars. Tom stepped back, giving her space. For a long, heavy moment, she didn't move. She just watched him, her deep brown eyes locked onto his. There was no fear in them now, no hesitation, and there was no aggression, either. What Tom saw in that gaze was something else, something he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, not exactly, but understanding, a quiet recognition, a silent acknowledgement that neither of them truly belonged in the other's world. And yet, for a brief moment in time, their lives had intertwined. Then, without a sound, she rose. She shook out her fur, sending a spray of frost into the air, then turned to her cubs. With a low, soft rumble, she nudged them forward. They obeyed without hesitation, following her as she moved toward the open door. Tom didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched as they stepped out onto the fresh snow, their small paws pressing into the untouched whiteness. The cubs hesitated at the threshold of the wild, blinking at the vast, open expanse before them, but their mother did not. She knew where she belonged. As she crossed the yard, she stopped once, just for a second. She turned her head, her gaze finding Tom one last time. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not gestures, just the simple, unspoken truth that they had both fought against something bigger than themselves. Against the storm, against the cold, against the rules that said this should not have happened. And yet, here they were. Then she turned away, stepping forward, leading her cubs into the forest. Tom watched them go, watched their dark forms disappear between the trees. Their tracks pressed deep into the snow. He stood there long after they had vanished, listening to the stillness they left behind. He had spent his whole life believing that nature must take its own course. But maybe, sometimes, just sometimes, nature allowed for something else. Not dependence, not control, just a moment of shared survival. And maybe that was enough.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.